Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. The end of 2019 is almost upon us, and I'm happy to say that I've gotten to 10 episodes. So this is the 10th episode of the podcast, and hopefully I can say the same thing when I get to 100 episodes and eventually 1,000 episodes, if I can think of content for 1,000 episodes. I hope so. But today I had on a very special guest. It is Dr. Eric Helms. I got to know Eric pretty well over the last year. I've been following him for many, many years, but this year in particular, I got to meet Eric on a number of occasions, spend a lot of time with him in the US, and get to know him on a personal basis. Eric does a lot of podcasts. He's the research and development chief for 3D Muscle Journey, who I have personally been a client of for my last few competitive seasons, and he puts out a ton of great information. But today I wanted to try and keep the podcast a little bit different and talk about perhaps Eric's journey to where he got to today and some of the key lessons that he learned along the way through his journey from when he originally started in the Air Force all the way to where he is today, doing research at the University of Auckland and putting out a ton of great content. And not only does Eric put out a lot of great content, he's also a practitioner in terms of bodybuilding. He competes in weightlifting, he also competes in strongman, and he's just an all-around good athlete. So without further ado, and before I move on, I want to say please do give a rating and review. Thank you for those who do or have done that already. It really helps with the ratings and the reviews and the algorithms, etc., etc. But let's get into this podcast with Eric Helms, and I won't keep you waiting any longer. So please welcome Eric Helms. Eric, my man, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Adam, my pleasure, sir. It's good to chat with you again, man.
It is, yeah. And for anybody not listening, I had the pleasure of competing with you on stage. When was it now? It was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, it would have been third weekend in July, and then I had the pleasure of eating with you after Worlds.
Yeah, and you got to see me eat like 2 kilos of sweets.
Yeah, man, you did it right. You got on the recovery train.
Yeah, pretty fast. And I just want to say, while I have you on air, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've put out into the community, as small as this community of bodybuilding, and not just bodybuilding, but natural bodybuilding is. I just want to thank you for that. And I kind of would, if anybody was asking who is Eric Helms, I personally would say Eric is like the modern day Layne Norton. So, I mean, it sounds kind of strange as if Layne Norton is like, you would swear by saying that he's like, you'd think he's 65 or something. But
he's
back
still
in
alive?
The day, I think so. Yeah. But back in the day when I first got into the kind of the forums and the boards and found natural bodybuilding, Layne was kind of like, when somebody thinks like, who's the best natural bodybuilder? People think, oh, Layne Norton at the time, right? But he wasn't actually even the best natural bodybuilder. But it's kind of like yourself now, like you're a very competitive natural bodybuilder. But if somebody was said like, who's a top natural bodybuilder? People that are kind of in it, everyone just thinks of Eric Helms as natural bodybuilding.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Like the same thing happens in Olympic weightlifting. Like people are like, oh, Clarence Kennedy, and like for example, he's not actually competing, but he does train. He's incredibly good. I would say arguably across the field of like weightlifters, he's better than I am across the field of bodybuilding. But I think when you have these niche sports where you have someone who ends up putting out information and they get a reasonable amount of a following or an audience, they kind of become the only person who a lay audience, and when I say lay, I just mean not involved in the sport they're from, who kind of sees them as the only person in the sport. While, if you ask me who the best natural bodybuilder was, I'd probably give you a list of 5 names, and most of the folks who think I'm, some kind of good natural bodybuilder wouldn't even know who I'm talking about. So, yeah.
Yeah, funny, actually, Clarence Kennedy is from Ireland. He's from Galway. And I remember seeing that guy is insanely strong, and he can do backflips and stuff.
Yeah, he's incredibly impressive. Don't get me wrong. It's the case of one of those things where you get exposed to someone through outside of their competition. Like people know that I compete in natural bodybuilding because like it's my pictures, it's what I talk about, and it's part of my quote unquote CV. But it's not like I got reasonably well known because I won the WNBF World, because no one gets reasonably well known from winning WNBF Worlds. It's always comes from some other type of promotion. Yeah.
Yeah, it's surprising. I was just reflecting on it after the WMBF Worlds. When I was going home from New York, I saw the winner, Kendall. I can't remember his second name.
Yep.
The guy who won the heavyweight and the
Yep.
overall.
The overall,
But, like,
Kendall, world champ. Awesome physique.
yeah, and yeah, he's got a great physique and two-time champion. But, like, nobody in the airport, like, even knew who he was. Like, not that I would expect people would, but just goes to show that even, like, the best bodybuilder per se, it's not that you don't become a celebrity, you know. So it's interesting.
No, yeah, I would say that this is one of those sports where your well-knownness doesn't extend outside of the fans of the sport. There's very few, I would say, Iron Game sports where that does happen. And actually, I think strongman's probably the only one. I think, but only to a certain degree. Like, everyone knows Hathor from Game of Thrones. But there are some people who know, like Martin Lisi's or Brian Shaw, because of their position in strongman, they've gotten to do, like, specials, and people are interested in what they eat, how they train, etc. You know, the World's Strongest Man has been televised for a while, but it's kind of one of those, you know, like, kind of freak one-off shows, like, kind of things, like worldwide, so the wild world of sports kind of feel, where it's one of those kooky, strange sports people watch. And I think when you think about what has probably the most entertainment value, you know, sitting through a 12-hour prejudging and finals is probably not at the top of the list. Likewise, watching people do 2 or 3 lifts to a max, you know, for a total of, you know, 10 seconds, you know, 6 or 9 times, and watching that happen over and over and over again without any kind of back and forth, that also doesn't have much appeal. But if you watch two huge, massive guys racing each other while lifting heavy weights that you couldn't even fathom lifting once in your entire life, and strange implements, and it seems to change all the time, now you've kind of got, like, you know, CrossFit with mind-blowing weights, you know, and then the appeal comes there. So it's kind of the I'd say it's the one sport in the Iron Game where you can garner attention just from what you do in the sport. You know, if you think about even the classics, like Arnold wasn't incredibly popular because he won 7 Olympias, because not everyone knows who Lee Haney is, right? And he's won 8. He's incredibly popular because of what he did outside of bodybuilding and how he used bodybuilding as a launch pad.
So now I understand your motive to get into strongman sports. It's purely for the fame aspect, right?
The goal is to become the governor of California, yes. 100%.
you got to work on your German accent a little bit.
Austria.
Eric, I wanted to have a more conversational topic today, or conversation. But talk us through how you first got into competitive bodybuilding, or maybe even before that, if we take a step back into science, or started to, you know, build your career in bodybuilding. Obviously, you started with your master's, but talk us through how you first got into this. You started in the Air Force, right?
Yeah, I mean, I first started lifting weights. Well, the funny thing is that the first time I ever lifted weights, it was for, I would say, either my freshman or sophomore year, as either part of track and field, or maybe with someone who went to my high school who was an avid bodybuilder when I was just kind of a guy who ran track in, like, our apartment gym. And both times I really didn't like it. I can actually think of a number of times where I got exposed to weightlifting and I was just like, this is dumb, you know. And I didn't get bit by the bug because I didn't have any emotional attachment to it. So there was early in high school, and then at a few spots when I ran track and field. There was then, once again, when I was early in my Air Force career, a good friend of mine who was also in like my basic training and then my training with me for my job, he exposed me to lifting weights, and neither time did it really click. I was just kind of hanging out with them. And then it wasn't until 2005 when I was in a pretty stressful spot. I couldn't travel home. I was in a long-distance relationship, and there was a lot of emotional strife going on at that time, but I couldn't travel because of the restrictions on my ability to take leave at the time. And I needed some kind of outlet, and I reached out to a friend of mine, Patrick, who's had Arnold Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. He was had a really good physique, and he trained very regularly. He was in incredibly good shape, and he kind of taught me the ropes. And once it had some kind of emotional juice behind it, that's when I really got bit by the iron bug. So I had on and off done some lifting, either for social reasons or as a part of sport, and it never clicked. But once I had that deeper meaning to it, that's when I couldn't keep myself out of the gym for the next, well, still today. So that was, almost 15 years ago.
And was that also the beginning of your academic career? Were you always someone that was interested in sciences, or were you a smart, teenager, or were you good in school? Because when people think of you now, Eric is so intelligent, or he's got a lot of knowledge, and obviously built that up over the years. But was that something that you're always interested in, or was it that you began lifting weights and then you kind of got interested in the science behind it?
Yeah, I've really tricked people into thinking I'm smart, which has worked to my advantage. But no, seriously, I was very much. I like to use the example of kind of Vince Vaughn in Dodgeball, where his kind of life philosophy is if you don't try very hard, then you won't fail. So you set a low bar, and you can always meet your own expectations. And I would say that was true for pretty much anything that the outside world put expectations on me. So, for example, I think I'm reasonably intelligent, and I would be able to get into like AP classes and honors classes in high school. Advanced placement is what AP stands for. But then I wouldn't push myself very far in them, and I would just get like a B, because I felt like I could kind of rest on my laurels and get a B in almost any class. But getting into the advanced placement and honors classes, you get additional points for your grade. It's like it gets bumped up to the next level. So you could get a 4.0 credit, which is the highest you can get by getting a B. So it's kind of like a B counts as a regular A. So I would get into these advanced placement classes and just kind of make it through. And I think I certainly had a fear as a teen, I would say, and maybe into my early 20s, that if I did really push myself and I gave it my all and I failed, that it said something that I was afraid that might have been true about me, that I wasn't actually as smart or as capable as I felt I needed to be accepted or to accept myself. But outside of things where there was some kind of social pressure, whether that was, sport or intelligence or academic grades, etc., I would get obsessed and I would get quite good at things. And these got applied to things you might expect from a, nerdy only child who, liked typical stuff that nerdy only child boys do, like video games and like role-playing games and reading fantasy books and sci-fi. I've read probably a book a month in the sci-fi or fantasy genre since I was, like 10 or 11. I was really, really good at a whole bunch of video games that are now probably not even ones that most people would recognize unless they're in their 30s and stuff like that. And I would just get really, really interested in it. So an interesting thing occurred when I got bit by the quote-unquote bodybuilding bug, is that obsessive nature of my personality now got applied to bodybuilding. And I have a very difficult time finding interest in things outside of the thing that I get obsessed with at any given time. So, for example, when I was really, really stoked about playing Halo back in the day, that's pretty much all I did outside my free time. Same thing with like Baldur's Gate back in the day. Like hip hop when I was into it, and writing. I was very into creative writing and poetry, and then like underground hip hop for one phase of my life. So when bodybuilding came around, that's when I knew it was probably going to become my career. One of the things I wanted to challenge myself with was actually finishing something, because that kind of Vince Vaughn element of my personality, when things got tough and I wasn't sure if I could push myself and make it past it, I didn't want that potential of failing. So I'd be like, no, I'm not interested anymore, or it doesn't do it for me. And I would kind of pull out early. So with bodybuilding, one of the things I told myself was, let's see this all the way. And I fortunately had very good mentoring early on. I had some actual competitive bodybuilders and folks who've been lifting for a long time. So I didn't have this mentality that somehow it would, I'd get a great physique in 6 months. I didn't really have perfect expectations, because you never know. And, the supplement industry fools you into thinking things happen faster than they do, or you can get further than you actually can. But I knew that this was going to be a multi-year investment if I was to build the kind of physique I wanted. And there were also some fortunate occurrences that happened along the way. In 2005, a local natural bodybuilding show ran by the WNBF that Rodney Hilaire put on for natural bodybuilding aficionados. They know that in the mid-2000s, he was the reigning heavyweight champ for a while in the WNBF. And he put this on in Augusta, Georgia, where I was stationed in the Air Force at the time. And they needed test judges. So they only had just enough to actually judge the show, and they needed to have a couple test judges. They were hoping to kind of build it out there. So I test judged, and because I was a bodybuilding fan from like the magazines and reading it online and everything, I did pretty well, except for the figure division, which I got totally wrong. But I had perfect agreement with the scores for the judges on the bodybuilding. And that was my first exposure to natural bodybuilding. And I found, there's this whole world out there. Because I was kind of under the impression, like, you take bodybuilding as far as you can, and once you kind of reach your natural potential, then you decide whether or not you want to go and get on gear. And then that's what kind of like the IFBB pro path. And I was so obsessed with lifting and all that I was starting to consider competitive bodybuilding. And then in 2005, I got exposed to natural bodybuilding. Shortly after that, the YMCA, where I was working as a personal trainer, decided to put on a powerlifting meet, and I learned about that. And so from very early on, my kind of general, I want to lift weights to get big and strong to deal with this emotional trauma, got shifted towards, I want to compete in strength in physique sport and do it naturally. And that kind of became my everything. And like I said, I was working as a personal trainer at the Y. That was the only really career path I was considering at that point, because the Air Force was, I could have stayed in that career path. I didn't want to work for the government. I didn't want to stay in linguistics, which was what I did in the Air Force. And I was very interested in learning everything I could about bodybuilding. And I thought being a personal trainer was a great vehicle for that, so that I could learn about programming, nutrition, psychology, all that. So that became, from that moment where I fell in love with bodybuilding and realized I didn't want to be a linguist anymore. That's when my career, my intellectual, my personal focus, I became an athlete, coach, trainer, academic, or at least put on that path sometime in 2005. And I wouldn't fully realize that until I had completed my education, which happened in 2017, and started my own business, and I think all the things that I'm known for now. So that was the beginning of a 10 plus year commitment, but and one that I challenged myself to stick to, because I previously did not stick to things.
It's funny that you say that you were previously somebody who would almost self-sabotage and not see things through. And just with the nature of natural bodybuilding, there is like no end point per se. So it's like you can never ever finish it, even if you try. At some point you'll ultimately die, but there's no end point to natural bodybuilding, unless your goal is like just to compete, or that's all that your goal is, just to get a medal or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think that was actually a really, really good thing. I don't think I fully knew it at the time, but kind of challenging myself to do that, and then deciding to get on stage, and then exactly what you were saying, where there is no end point to natural bodybuilding, eventually kind of opened my mind and had tremendous changes on my personality and who I was, because I went through the process of contest prep and knew from the start I wasn't going to quit. And that was probably the first thing that I 100% finished. I did, of course, complete an enlistment in the Air Force. And, for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old young man who kind of has that Vince Vaughnish background, like I mentioned, on the self-sabotage elements, going through basic training was a really good experience for me. That built some self-efficacy, made me realize that I could be a top performer. And then my career field was one that was very, very demanding. There was 2 years of basically 8 hours a day for 2 years straight, with only 3 weeks off in total, of learning Arabic in an immersion environment. And we had about a 50% fail rate in our class. And I was like the 51st person, like I just passed by the hair on my chinny chin chin. And I realized that there's absolutely nothing wrong with pushing yourself, completing something, and not necessarily being the best, but still, that I succeeded. And that gave me a lot more nuance to some of my attitudes. And so when I got into bodybuilding, I was like, hey, you know what? You're not going to know how good you can be until you push yourself for a decade. And that was, I remember there was a specific competitive bodybuilder who was natural, who mentioned that to me. He was like, people don't realize that bodybuilding is a lifestyle, and you're not going to know what you're going to get out of it until you put in a decade. And I took that to heart. I was like, okay, I'm only 21, 22. All right, so in my 30s, I'll know if I've done this thing. And at that point, you're in. Like, there's no out. Like, whether like, it's not like you put in 10 years of work and you go, I didn't build a very good physique. Well, I'm never going to lift again, So I basically put myself in a position where I was the only way to survive, if you will, And to not have an existential crisis was to become more intrinsically motivated, to find more meaning in what I was doing, and to focus on the journey. And that's probably no surprise that I hooked up with the 3D Muscle Journey crew, and that I now have something called Iron Culture, and that I'm very much involved in what I would say is almost a spiritual way with the Iron game, and that I find a lot of meaning in my life beyond just simply the competitive outlet.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and thanks for sharing that. So back in 2005, when you did, was that when you did your first show, or when you were just working as a personal trainer?
Yeah, so let's see. I think I actually started lifting in 04. I got my timeline a little wrong. So I started lifting in 04. I became a personal trainer in 05. I was a test judge either in early 06 or late 05. I can't quite remember. I think it might have been 06. And that might have been like in March. I want to say maybe March or April. I think that's when the WBF Iron Eagle was held back then, Rodney Hilaire's show. So in early to mid 2006, I became aware of natural bodybuilding, and then in August is when that powerlifting meet was put on. So sometime by the mid-year of 2006, I was kind of all in, and I knew what my goals were. And I remember this is right around the time in late 05, early 06, I started posting on the bodybuilding.com forums, and I found who you brought up before. I knew him as Straight Flexed at the time. That was Lane Norton's handle.
Yeah.
He was a moderator on the forums, and he also had just started around that time Inside the Life, which was a kind of documentary style in kind of the old MTV like real world kind of style series online of Inside the Life of a Natural Bodybuilder. And I got introduced to like Jim Cordova and some of the other WBF personalities, and Lane Norton's take on peaking, and started reading his articles. And one of the things I found early on was that because of my kind of obsessive personality, I was just as interested in the science and the application of bodybuilding theory and concepts as I was as the actual experience of being in the gym. And very early on, I got super interested in the scientific side of things, and I found that I excelled there. And this is one of those cases where I got a lot more respect in the bodybuilding world early on for my ability to engage, be a critical thinker, put forth good ideas. And my experience as a trainer, I was successful there overall. Obviously, I had many of the same errors most personal trainers make early on. But I was pretty good on the theory and practice side as a trainer and intellectual for bodybuilding and powerlifting and strength sport. And I think that really motivated me to keep pushing in that direction. And that's really how I kind of carved out that niche for me. I was rewarded, and I found that I was probably better intellectually as a bodybuilder, researcher, coach, etc., than I was physically as a competitive bodybuilder. I don't think I'm a slouch by any means, but I always find it hilarious that there are people online who think I'm like a really good natural bodybuilder, when I would say I'm a good enough amateur that I will probably turn WMDF pro one day, but I am not yet. And in the pro ranks, I think I've got a lot of work before I'm even a mid-level pro. So that's the kind of thing where certain elements of culture in the community, they kind of limit the beliefs of what people think they can accomplish. I've heard people go like, yeah, well, Eric Helms is the best natural bodybuilder because everyone else is on gear, and I'm like, God, if you only knew. So it's a funny thing, but yeah, The intellectual side of it was rewarded, and then I kept putting my finger in deeper, and then I really started to apply myself, and kind of each step of the way, I built more self-efficacy. And I'm kind of skipping ahead of the story, but I remember completing my bachelor's while I was a full-time trainer and thought, oh, that's awesome. And then I got my CSCS, which is the one of the higher level strength conditioning certifications you can get. And once I did that, I was like, maybe I could do my master's. And then once I finished my master's, I thought maybe I could actually do like a research-based degree and give back. And I did my second master's and moved out to New Zealand to my PhD, and it kind of just snowballed. The more I put in effort, saw that effort was fruitful, and I was producing things that were useful and appreciated by the community, and that I was becoming more intelligent, and that it was having beneficial effects on my clients and also my own physique. The more I was continuing to push further, and I really started to enjoy just the process of being a science communicator. And each step of the way, it opened my eyes that I could take it a little further. I never thought that I had the ability or drive to do, a master's, let alone a PhD, let alone, be working as an academic after the fact, or being a reviewer for mass, et cetera, et cetera. So I was kind of building the road ahead of me that I walked, even though that was my goal from the start, was to just take this as far as I could. I don't think I knew how far I could lay that track ahead of me. And each time I put down a new track and I didn't fall off, I was like, oh, maybe I'm a little more capable than I think I am. So in many ways, ironically, putting on Dream Tan and starving myself and flexing in a Speedo on stage really is the kind of the pathway to me getting a lot more self-efficacy, more belief, and being a much more capable human than I thought I could before. And that's really why I feel such a strong desire to pay it forward and give back to the sport, because it truly changed my life's trajectory in a very positive way.
Yeah, I think you need to give yourself probably a little bit more slack on the bodybuilding side of things. You placed very well this season. How many shows did you compete in? 4 or 5?
Yeah, I did 4 shows, and then the very last one I competed in 2 divisions. So yeah, I did the INBF Polynesian Muscle Mayhem in April. It's kind of like a quote unquote warm up show early in the season, and then I did the INBF River City Classic, which is in Sacramento. And then when we competed together, it was 2 weeks later at the now famous INBF Muscle Mayhem in Sacramento that used to be known as the Cap City, that I did way back in 2009, the year 3DMJ was formed, and then Jeff and I did it together for the 10-year anniversary. Very competitive show, as you know, and you did very well. You got into the overall. That was an awesome overall. And then finally, I think 3 or 4 weeks after that, I did a show here, a NZIFBB natural show in August, and that was the last one. And I tried out the classic physique and also bodybuilding division there. So I did 4 shows and went through 5 different divisions. And yeah, I had a good season. Yeah.
So take it back a bit, when you were starting off your competitive seasons back in 2009, correct? 2007?
2007 was my first competitive season, yeah.
Were you simultaneously doing your masters, and what were your masters in? So you did your bachelor's in sports or exercise science, if I'm not wrong.
So yeah, 2007, I had just gotten out of the Air Force, and then I stayed in where I was at Augusta, Georgia for a while until my wife got out of the Air Force. So both of us were linguists. She and I both wanted to get into a career field we actually enjoyed. Neither one of us were in love with our job in the Air Force. So in late 2006, we both moved to California, where my family's from, and where she has some family, and where she went to high school. So we moved back. We moved to Sacramento end of 2006. I left the YMCA there, where I'd been a trainer for about a year and a half, and kind of cut my chops learning how to be a personal trainer. And then in January of 2007, I started my first contest prep. And I did 2 shows in May. I did the INBA Silver and Black, which is an Oakland show. Silver and Black's the color of the Raiders, our NFL pro team. And that's where I met Alberto Nunez. That was also his first show. So that was my first natural bodybuilding in-person buddy who wasn't on the forums. And then I did, the following weekend, I did a local NPC show. I just did basically the next show I could find because I was so burnt out from dieting. And that was the NPC Contra Costa. And it was two very different experiences. As the first show I did was a small kind of backyard natural show. Everyone was helping each other. All were like buddy, very mom and pop feeling. And the Contra Costa is at a university, Chabot College, and while the Silver and Black is typically at a high school, and I think there was maybe 50 total people in the show, while there was hundreds in the NPC show. There was 23 in the novice middleweights where I was, and it was a national, an NPC Nationals qualifier. Jay Cutler, who had just won the Olympia, if I recall correctly, was the guest poser who I met. And it was just a gigantic show. So it was a very, very different experience. I got to see kind of the full spectrum of bodybuilding that season. And that was at the same time as I was doing my undergraduate work. So I was going to school at the local junior college, which is basically the community college that you can do all of your general ed education. So I know you're from Ireland, but in the U.S. we have a system where your bachelor's is typically 4 years in length, and the first 2 years are primarily dedicated to general education. Regardless of your major, it looks pretty much the same, and only the last 2 years do you specialize. So I got a associate's degree, which is essentially if you do the first 2 years and just graduate there, and then you would then from there go on to a bachelor's. I did an associate's degree in liberal arts at the local community college, and I got my certifications. And then I want to say in 2008, I took my associate's degree and I started a online bachelor's degree program that you could only get into if you were a full-time personal trainer at the time, or at least part-time. And that was in fitness and wellness. It was a sports management degree. So it was like half fitness and wellness, half fitness economics, and it was designed for people who are going to make a career in fitness. And it was one of the few online degree programs at the time, and it was still kind of a sketchy thing. So I spent a lot of time investigating and talking to prior graduates and looking it up, and I found that this was at the Cal U. It's California University of Pennsylvania, which is funny because it's a school in Pennsylvania, but there's a city called California, and it's actually a pretty well-known school where a lot of athletic trainers get their program, and they started, or get their degree in person, and they started an online program focused on fitness professionals, and it was the highest ranked at the time. And they just started the master's, or they had the master's for a few years, and they just started the bachelor's. So my cousin had done the master's, really liked it, and said it's perfect for someone who's kind of self-motivated, is working full-time, and likes to, and can only has some time to study on their own, and is self-directed. And I said, sweet. So I tried the bachelor's, and I had such a good experience that I went on to do the master's. So I finished my bachelor's in 2009, and then started the master's immediately after the next semester. And that was pretty tough, because I competed in 2009, and I also competed in 2011. So I competed my second season through the tail end of my bachelor's, and then I competed in my third season in 2011 at the tail end of my master's, while I was also preparing for my research-based master's that I came to New Zealand for. So I had not learned my lesson. Multiple times I was in school while doing a bodybuilding prep, and that was something I decided not to do again once I actually got involved in research here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I just I kind of experienced that with the tail end of my prep this year, from September to November, being in a master's program. It just mentally, it's just stressful with not just the time management, but just you're just not in the best kind of mindset to be able to give enough mental resources to studying and to putting all your effort. And I think you mentioned in a previous podcast that if you're going to do both, one of them is going to take a hit, and I feel like that probably did happen. I didn't do the best in either of either one, so I didn't do the best in my natural bodybuilding, nor did I do the best in or what I could have done in my master's degree. But I guess it's a lesson learned, which you clearly didn't learn.
Yeah, I mean, I eventually learned it, but it took me two goes, and so, and I think it's also a valuable thing to learn, because like life doesn't stop for academics or bodybuilding. So if you recognize that you can't do everything optimally all the time, and that's just some kind of a pie in the sky lack of reality, and you wouldn't want to anyway. Most of the bodybuilders who I know who try to control their environment to make their bodybuilding better, they eventually just get less and less resilient, and mess up their relationships, including their relationship with their body and their food, become shittier humans and temporarily better bodybuilders, but eventually just burn out. If you look at almost every successful bodybuilder, and when I mean successful, I don't mean just won once in a local show and then stopped, but I mean has a career in bodybuilding and competing at the highest level they're capable of for a long time, they find a way to integrate it into their life. So, I didn't do it a third time, but I did learn from the first two times, So the only B I got in my undergrad was because I got a due date wrong, and I think I transposed the month and the day in my head, and I just completely missed the due date on a big project. And the highest grade I could get with the available points remaining was a B, and I was just kicking myself because I actually had the project done in advance, and I just didn't submit it on time. It was just a complete bonehead diet brain moment. So I made a commitment when I did my master's that my priorities would be in the right place. And my master's, I got a 4.0 in, and I learned a lot. So I was, all of my cardio sessions that I did on a piece of cardio equipment, and this is 2011, so it was before a lot of ebooks really. I would just bring my textbooks with me and use all of my cardio time as studying time. So I got all of my reading done through prep, if you will. And then I had a life in 2011 that was, I truly didn't have time for anything more. Like a lot of people say, I don't have time for that. What they really mean is I don't have energy for that. I'm burnt out. And I probably only had 2 or 3 hours to myself every day because I was teaching 30 hours a week at a personal training college. Basically, they had an associate's degree program for personal trainers. I was designing courses there. I still had a few clients. I was still doing some work in the studio through 2010 and 11 and a little bit of in-home personal training. But then I also had a full-time roster at 3DMJ. And on top of that, I was finishing my last semester of my master's and preparing for my master's in New Zealand. I was starting to work on my literature review and getting the initial paperwork done. And I was actually doing some work for my advisor out in New Zealand. I was teaching a graduate level course on enhancing muscular performance and doing grading while I was still in California. And then finally, of course, I was doing my 2011 contest prep. So I would wake up and I would do client work till about noon. And then we would go to the gym if it was a training day. And I would use that time where I almost always was doing cardio to study. And then I would come home, do my work for 3DMJ as well as my schoolwork that I had to get done. And then I would teach night classes, get home at 10 p.m. And then we would watch like one episode of Netflix, my wife and I'd go to bed and do it all over again. And I had to save up all this money to go to New Zealand because it was very expensive. And I actually ran a kind of online cyber begging campaign. And I'm still very grateful to this day because I had a lot of people who donated over 3 different periods. I got, I think, a total of like 5,000 USD. And it was absolutely necessary because when it was all said and done, we'd, paid for our security deposit, gotten our car, gotten our cats over, moved there, bought our furniture, settled ourselves in, and I'd gotten my tuition fees paid, and had to get a loan and started to pay that off. We were down to just a couple grand that we lived off for a while until I was able to get my roster back up and get steady income, and I had to get a stipend, which I was very fortunate I was able to do for my master's. So it was just enough, and that was with me saving all the money I made for a year that didn't go into expenses and doing all that. So it was almost easy in a way because there were no options. There was no time for me to decide when and what I was going to do. There were time slots available for one master's, time slot available for another, time slot available for when I was at work teaching, time slot available for when I was working with my clients, time spot available for my studies and my programs, and that was it.
So after you did that first master's, was it daunting to try and take on another master's, or was that something that you knew you wanted to do straight away? And was it because one was more so in the exercise science, and the other was nutritional sciences? Is that why you decided to do two, or is it because the second was more so research based?
Yeah, I had a really cool team when I was teaching at what was Bryan College and what became Bryan University, where that associate's degree program for personal trainers was. That was where I really became, where I really started to accelerate my learning. There's the cliche in academics that nothing teaches you better than teaching. And I was teaching there in 2010 and 2011 and briefly into 2012. And this was right when the economy had started to recover after the crash. So we had basically two types of students, folks who were just out of high school who decided they wanted to become personal trainers. And they didn't quite fit into the categories of people who were going to the traditional university route. And then we also had people who were middle-aged who had lost a stable job, but were always into fitness and decided, you know what, now that I get back into the workforce, I'm going to try a career in personal training. So trying to explain the same concepts to an 18-year-old who'd been lifting weights for maybe a couple years in high school and who just got out of classes, 6 months ago, and a 40-year-old who has not been in school for 22 years, but has been lifting weights for 22 years, they have a very different frame of reference. And for me, kind of sitting in between both of them in my late 20s with a fair amount of academic and lifting experience, I had to kind of be the bridge between them both and teach to two very different audiences. And you really have to look at each concept from a very different angle and figure out how to teach it to the audience you have. And it makes you realize all the holes that you actually have in your knowledge, that you have all these heuristics in your head and you think you know things, but the questions that you get asked are questions that you never considered. So I really I gained a lot of confidence while I was putting things into practice for myself as an athlete, for my clients who were general population, for my clients who were competitive strength athletes and bodybuilders through 3DMJ, teaching 18-year-olds and teaching middle-aged people all at the same time while also studying my master's. So I think I was gaining a lot of confidence, and I went from being a very bad teacher, kind of like I started as a relatively bad personal trainer, becoming a good personal trainer, a good teacher. And I was getting so much positive feedback, and we had these ratings from the students, and I was getting very highly rated. And while I was just completing a bachelor's and starting my master's, I was teaching alongside people who had master's degrees and PhDs. The requirement was to have certain nationally recognized certifications, a bachelor's, and a certain amount of industry experience, or have a higher level degree and that. So we kind of had this broad spectrum. And there was a gentleman we called Dr. Z, not Dr. Zerdos. This is a different Dr. Z, and I give him a lot of credit because he encouraged me, along with Dr. B. We had these two PhD level lecturers and administrators who worked at Bryan College, who taught, and they definitely were influential in my career. And they always encouraged me to go further, and they thought that I had academic chops. So I was looking at local PhD programs, and I thought that the next evolution to go from my bachelor's, which was in fitness and wellness, and then my master's, which was going to be in exercise science and performance enhancement, was then to do a PhD. And at that point, I just figured, I've got these online degrees, this experience, but I've never done research. A PhD is all about that, so I'll just get in wherever they can take me. So I just started kind of looking around locally, because that's where my career was. That's where the 3DMJ crew was. That's where the place I was teaching was at. That's where the personal training studio that I'd worked at for years was. So I was looking at local schools, and then one day I was asking Dr. Z, I was saying, hey, I really want to do applied stuff. I want this to impact my career as a bodybuilding and coach in powerlifting and strength sport. And he said, well, you probably want to get a PhD in either sports nutrition or strength conditioning. And I was like, okay, cool. So where's that? And he was like, well, there's not many in the States. Have you ever thought about looking at Australia? And my initial reaction was, I can't go to Australia. But then I thought, hold on. My primary income, besides teaching here, is online coaching. And I have clients in Australia. Why couldn't I go to Australia? And the school that I started looking at was Edith Cowan in Perth. And once I started looking at Edith Cowan, I thought I should look everywhere. So I started looking at schools in the UK and then New Zealand. And eventually, from everyone who I talked to and the emails I sent out, I had a Skype with John Cronin, Professor John Cronin here at AUT, who would eventually become my mentor supervisor for my master's, and then my primary supervisor for my PhD, and now my colleague and mentor just in academics in general, who I owe a lot to. We Skyped, and he was the director of the Sports Performance Research Institute in New Zealand at the time, which is kind of a rotating role between the full-time professors. And that was it blew my mind. It was the first time someone in a high-level position who was a relative legend in our field just, was happy to hop on Skype with me. And the feeling I got for AUT is what drew me there. And then what shook out as to why I went the direction of nutrition or training and what my degrees went to was the doors that opened and the constraints that came about from deciding, AUT is the place I want to go. I found out about AUT because in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research and the Strength and Conditioning Journal, a bunch of students were publishing very applied, interesting studies. I saw a study that came out in JSCR that was on hormonal adaptations to medium load, high volume training versus high load, low volume training. So kind of like powerlifting versus bodybuilding style and what adaptations occurred. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And then there was another study that was being done on bands and chains and strength adaptations in powerlifting. And there was another study by a guy named Justin Keogh, who eventually would move on from AUT and go to Australia to be an academic, and ended up being an examiner on my PhD. But anyway, way back then, he was doing research on strongman. And I was like, this is so cool. Like, this is a university that has an S&C department that is specifically publishing research on strength sport. So I was really interested in AUT. And then the experience I had Skyping with JC, John Cronin, was great. And I went into that kind of expecting it to be like the Western model, where generally you only go to a place if they have funding, they have a spot, and then you kind of let them know that you're familiar with their research and you slot into something that they're already doing. And John turned that on its head when I asked him, hey, like what projects you got? And he said, forget that. What do you want to study? And I was like, whoa. And he basically said, hey, if we can figure out a way to do it, I can find you the right supervisors. We've got a pretty damn good lab. We've got this new facility built called AUT Millennium. And you'll have about a couple grand to your name when you do your PhD. And then we just needed to figure out logistically what was my path forward. Now, in the UK, New Zealand, Australian system, it's a little different than Canada and the US. If you're going to do a PhD, you're expected to already have research experience. And as you know, you do shorter bachelors that are much more targeted. You don't have this 2 years of undergraduate degree that is purely based on general ed. You get pretty much right into your area of interest when you do a bachelor's. So by the time a student in the New Zealand, Australia, UK system is getting to the point where they're going to do their PhD, they've had more coursework than someone in the U.S. New Zealand system typically, and that's why. The U.S. Canadian systems. That's why in the U.S. and Canadian system, your first couple years of a PhD are your qualifications and your qualifying exams and your classes. But there are no classes by the time you get to the PhD in this system, and you are required to have prior research experience. So since I had a master's by coursework only, I was actually required to get research experience. And there's a degree that is pretty common, but not incredibly common. It exists in the New Zealand, UK, Australian system called a Master's of Philosophy, or an MPhil for short. And it pretty much exists specifically for people who have coursework-only masters or have done a postgraduate diploma or have done a professional master's. So essentially they've done the equivalent of all the master's coursework, but no master's thesis. So that means they don't qualify for a PhD, but they've already basically done the equivalent of all the master's coursework. So it is just a 1-year master's thesis, and it's called a Master of Philosophy, kind of like what a PhD is, which is actually a doctorate of philosophy. So all PhDs are technically doctorates of philosophy, and then your topic defines the area. So anyway,
would that be similar to an MRes?
A Master's of Research, yes, very similar. I think that's basically the same thing. No coursework, you just go straight in and you start doing research once you've done a proposal and you've gotten your ethics approved.
So after that, you got straight into, after that 1 year research, what was your research topic for that 1 year in the MPhil?
Yeah, so when I started talking to John, and he was like, what do you want to study? And I said, hey, look, my whole goal here is to be an expert in the sports of strength sport and physique sport. And so that kind of positioned me that I needed to be. So that's why if you look at my publication history now, fast forwarding to almost 2020, you'll see stuff on the psychology of physique sport. You'll see stuff on auto-regulation in powerlifting. You'll see stuff on optimizing protein intake in bodybuilders. So some people might get exposed to my research and go, oh, he's a protein researcher. Other people go, oh, he's an auto-regulation guy. And other people go, oh, he's like a eating disorder sports psych guy. And I'm none of those. I'm actually just a strength sport and bodybuilding researcher. So if it intersects with something that is relevant to these pursuits and ways that I can help people improve performance, my kind of tagline is improving sustainable performance. That means I kind of have to be a little more holistic inside of these sporting realms. So anyway, once I explained that to JC, I said, I'd really like to get some experience on the nutrition and training side of things. So for my MPhil, I specifically looked at protein intake. And at the time, there was very little research looking at protein intake in dieting strength athletes who were lean. So I wanted to explore the possibility that maybe the reason why bodybuilders anecdotally report that high protein intakes are beneficial, but the research has never corroborated that, was because they're specifically finding that it's helpful in a dieting state. And there was a lot of mechanistic research that would point to protein being a more dominant fuel source when you're lean, active, and also in a calorie deficit, and that those who lift weights benefit and can get greater gains when taking in a higher protein intake. So I thought, hey, during a bodybuilding contest prep, all those things happen concurrently, and that may be when these anecdotally recommended higher protein intakes of a gram per pound or higher might be beneficial. And that was that line of research that I explored from 2012 to around 2014 that I still dabble in now and when I get the opportunity to do so. But that was the focus of my master's.
Yeah, so to go back to, I think it was what you mentioned in Bryant College, you were teaching and you learned a lot about what you didn't know or didn't know how to communicate. Was it Bryant College that you were teaching at?
That's the one. Yep. Eventually became Bryant University, but yes.
Yeah, so I think that's where you probably learned a lot of your skills of communicating science, because that's probably one of your strong points. I don't know if that's something that you're aware of, but certainly I personally, as a follower of you, who've now only began almost my academic career in specific nutrition and exercise, that I've been following you for like, I don't know how many years, but you're very easily able to convey the more scientific topics and break them down into everyday layperson terminology. And I suppose you probably agree with me and say that Lane Norton was quite good at that as well. And that's how I kind of got interested in science per se. But when I'm saying science, I used to just basically read through all the muscular development forums that he wrote on and just parrot what he'd said and quote that as science, but not really understanding, the true mechanisms behind it. But he was able to explain more complex topics and then put them into words that were easily digestible for people who necessarily weren't in science or didn't necessarily want to be in science, but just wanted to perhaps apply scientific practices. I think that's something that you're pretty good at, especially with the books that you've put out recently, or I'll say recently, but the last couple of years, the muscle and strength pyramids, or is that what they're called? I can't remember the exact name.
Yeah, muscle and strength pyramids.
So they're very easily digestible with often quite complex topics. And even now I find when I'm diving into PubMed that some of the research is actually, even for me now, and I'm like, well, I'm saying net me now, but I'm not even that long into my academic career, but it's quite complex to understand. And to be able to then take that and digest that and deliver it to people who are, like you said, 40 and haven't been in academics for 20 years or in high school or just out of high school, and to be able to divulge that and convey it in a way that everybody can understand, it was probably quite difficult. And it's probably one of the reasons why you've gained a lot of, I suppose, notoriety in the bodybuilding community.
I don't think you're wrong, and a lot of kudos does go to some of my early influences, and Lane Norton is among them, along with Dr. Joe Klimczewski, and a few others at the time who could do exactly what you were talking about. They could distill complex information into practical application and do it in a way that, a bodybuilder with a high school education who's in a totally different field and may not even be that interested in the science, but knew how it could be applied. And then in the next post online, on the forums or in a Facebook group, they could get approached by someone who was heavily nerding out in the science and also hang there. So it was that, and I saw the connection between the two. Like, you had to really understand the mechanisms to understand the application to then be able to distill it down and explain it to someone else. And there's a really good quote that's attributed to Einstein, that if you can't explain something simply, you don't know it well enough. And that was something I took to heart early on. And you're 100% right that the place I learned that skill was at Bryant College. And I got quite good, I think, at explaining it. And then I got really lucky in that a client who probably some of your listeners have heard of, Matt Ogus, came around, contacted us in 2010. I talked to him on the phone, and we discussed a 2011 prep. And, I helped him through that process. And it was kind of the first time he'd had his eyes open to some very basic concepts that are, absolute game changers for people who don't understand their importance of progressive overload in the gym and a calorie deficit when it comes to, contest prep. And he got into much better shape than he had the prior year. And it really just kind of totally opened his eyes. And he was creating a YouTube channel at the time. This is back when there was only a handful of people doing YouTube, and even like a 10,000 follower channel was huge. And he asked if it would be okay with me after his contest prep season to do some like Q&A videos. And this is kind of where I went from where like it seems like when you start to put out content online and you try to make a difference, the amount of work you do to start to get that ball rolling is so disproportionate. I was writing multiple blog posts a month. I was posting on the forums all the time, logging. I was doing everything you could in that era of pre-social media to try to put out good information and start my career, and really not going anywhere. But then all of a sudden, everything catapulted around 2011, and it was the right timing because I had cut my chops at Bryan College. I had I was almost completed my first master's, and I had been a coach and a personal trainer now for like 6 or 7 years, and I had competed in 10 plus combined bodybuilding shows and powerlifting meets and helped close to 100 competitors do the same. So I actually knew what the hell I was talking about, and if I'd had this opportunity a year prior or 2 years prior, it probably wouldn't have gone well. If I was well known, it would have been for being an idiot. It wouldn't have been good. And
how do you know people don't know you for that still?
Absolutely. I mean, there you go. That's my biggest claim to fame, is being an idiot who doesn't know it. I'm the shining example of Dunning-Kruger. So yeah, I was given this opportunity at a time where I could actually deliver, and I was able to provide. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things in those videos back in 2011 that I don't agree with today, which I think is a good thing, and that I had wrong. But I'd say on the whole, I was providing utility, I was providing value, and based on the information we had at that time, I was probably more right than wrong, which is not bad looking back almost 10 years ago. And I was able to communicate things in a pretty reasonable way and a pretty understandable way for a young non-academic audience. And I knew when someone wanted me to bottom line it for them and help them understand a concept, but I also knew when someone was clearly lacking a really important aspect of critical thinking. I knew when, and this is something that annoys a lot of people, but I just know how important it is. I've been able to tell because I've watch students go from the start to the finish of my class, and at a certain point, just memorizing knowledge can really bite you in the ass because it doesn't give you the skills you need to actually be adaptable and apply it to different situations. When people just want a black and white answer, when there is not one, that's when I get a little more Socratic with them, and I ask them to actually start thinking rather than just simply trying to get an answer, because that answer actually does them a disservice. It's oversimplifying something that is actually not that simple. There's another good quote from, I think also attributed to Einstein, that is, things should be explained as simply as possible, but no simpler. Because at a certain point, when you use a heuristic or you use a model to describe something, it becomes more wrong than right and no longer useful. There's also a great statistician who says, I'm just quoting the hell out of these cliches, but they're good, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And that's kind of where you have to draw that distinction. It's like, all right, this person is coming up to me. Do they need me as a mechanic or an engineer? Some people are a bodybuilder and they need to know what to do, but they still need to know why to do it. Like your mechanic still needs to tell you, this is why you came in here and needed your car fixed. Here's something you need to pay attention to in the future. Guess what? You need to change your oil regularly, and here's why. And you go, oh shit, I get it. But you don't need to necessarily explain to them how a combustion engine works. If someone comes to you as an engineer, meaning that they have kind of this certain level of nerdy curiosity, they're still just going to get their oil changed every month, but they also want to know the intricate details of it. So I was getting better and better at identifying when it was appropriate to do one versus the other. And this was at a time when there were people who were always acting like engineers because they were trying to sound smart, or they just didn't really understand the actual application, and they were using science in inappropriate ways, not understanding the nuance to it. So I think I stepped into a niche that was rather unfilled. This is also a time when people would use science kind of like religion, and it was in a period where people were at war with quote-unquote bro science. And it was okay to be a complete asshole and use religion like a stick. And the problem with that is, use science like a stick, almost like religion. And the problem with that is that it discourages critical thinking. It silences dissent, and you basically become a guru who uses science for marketing. And your goal isn't to actually teach people to be critical thinkers. It's to make yourself seem smart and right, to criticize other people, and to be the smartest person in the room. And that is inherently unscientific. And that's kind of something that I saw as an important message. And I think, unfortunately, I was sort of unique in that way. And I'm glad to see that change. It's not something I want to be unique in. I think that should kind of be the stock standard, because there was a lot of people who had quote unquote evidence-based beliefs, but they were just parroting what their favorite personality said, which is no different than parroting someone who, says do this because the bros do it, or because I'm a world champion, or whatever.
It's like I said earlier, and I don't think I was necessarily using it as a stick, but I was no better than the bro scientists back in the day. It's just that I was fortunate to find Layne Norton and the likes of Dr. Joe and yourself, rather than finding Jay Cutler or Phil Heath, even though I actually did follow them. But I was no better than somebody who was copying what they said, and you should do this because Phil Heath said it, when I was just saying, well, you should do it because Layne Norton says it. And I think with I don't really know why. I guess it's just because we're in a more of an information age that science is becoming more, or evidence-based, quote unquote, is becoming more popular now, especially in the natural bodybuilding community. But a lot, like you said, a lot of people don't have that critical element to it. And I've only, even myself, started to realize that I know less, and I'm almost less confident in giving specifics or absolutes as I learn more, because as you know yourself, the more you learn, the more critical you can your thinking becomes, and you start to not second guess yourself, but question results, or question studies or things that people do. And I think that, like you said, it's better if the industry does come that way. But how would people that aren't necessarily going to go into academics, because obviously everybody isn't, how can they be critically or think critically without necessarily having that background in academics?
Well, the beauty of it is that critical thinking is separate from the knowledge you have. For anyone who's ever played like a video game where you have like role-playing stats, it's the difference between a skill going up and your ability, like having a high intelligence score versus having a high like mathematics score or something like that. So knowledge in a certain domain is not the same thing as your ability to be rationally skeptic. So if you can teach someone critical thinking and how to evaluate, whether information might be correct or not, which is essentially giving someone like a BS detector in the fitness industry, those are two separate things. The beauty of the latter is that it is a teachable skill, but it's something we have to actually emphasize. So baked into a lot of the things I do are getting people outside of black and white thinking. Kind of the biggest sign of someone who doesn't have critical thinking, or haven't really developed that, or doesn't think of a certain domain in that way, is try to distill things down to black or white, wrong or right, yes or no, binary kind of answers. And you'll see this in media, for example. You'll get an expert on who'll give them a 5-minute answer, and then the newscaster will blink twice and go, is it bad or good? And it's very frustrating. And it's typically the kind of stuff that you'll hear about nutrition passed around at the dinner table. And the problem isn't whether the information is wrong or right. It's that the entire frame of thinking about this information, it makes it impossible for you to be wrong or right. You're almost always wrong when you don't have critical thinking. So some of the things that I recommend people do is to try to think in ranges and continuums instead of either on or off, and to ask questions that get to the root of things, and to realize that there can't be a one-size-fits-all answer. This is not math. This is not physics. This is dealing with people. We're talking about having to fit methods and strategies to individual contexts that include your desires, your goals that are different, individual biology, psychology, sociology, geography, having access to different foods and gyms, etc., and all of that. So some of the things that people can do who don't have an academic background is to, when they start to follow people to get information from, whether that's Jay Cutler, and there's nothing wrong with following people at a high level who are just athletes, just know what information they have that's useful, and also following quote unquote evidence-based folks, there's information that can be gleaned from both, is to pay attention to things that go against critical thinking. So for example, if someone speaks in absolutes, always, never, must, if someone tends to sensationalize things, if someone tends to, instead of considering the ideas or opinions of others, they deride them. Being condescending is essentially just a disguised logical fallacy. That's attacking the person rather than the idea. You're trying to discredit the person rather than actually addressing their ideas, when you're dismissive with someone. And that's really the problem that I was talking about with kind of the age I came up in, was that you were allowed to be an asshole, and so long as you were kind of using science, quote unquote, you could be dismissive and make fun of people. But the problem there is that you're just signaling to everyone around you that I'm smarter than them, they're bad because they're dumb, and #science. But in reality, what you're doing is you're trying to win an argument. And as soon as you decide I'm trying to win, rather than I'm trying to get to the truth, you've entrenched yourself just as much as someone who entrenches themselves by putting their money behind an idea. They now have a financial bias and they can't step away from it. You have an ego bias. You can't step away from it because then, oh shit, now I'm wrong, and publicly. And now I can no longer be the successful guru. So the entire attitude of someone can give you hints as to whether or not they are a pretty good rational thinker, which means that their information will hopefully evolve over time, and it will more often be right or lead you towards being right eventually. So if they speak in terms of probability, which is the way science actually works, if they acknowledge that there are individual differences, if they don't speak in absolutes, if they are not necessarily selling systems, but they may be, like, there's nothing wrong with buying a book or buying something if it talks about, a philosophy or theory or understanding the nuances of how to create something that's individualized. But there's a difference between programs and principles. And the same can be applied for nutrition. Anytime there's a one-size-fits-all, or anytime there are kind of hand-waving, where basically someone uses a lot of sciencey words, but they seem purposefully complex, that doesn't really teach you anything. It just convinces you that the person's smarter than you, so you just go, okay, yes, whatever you say is right. So you can see that science has been used as a marketing tool forever, going all the way back into the late 1800s and the dawn of the kind of the physical culture being marketed. Sure, you can certainly take the appeal to authority of being an athlete, but the appeal to the authority of science has always been there as well. And that's simply when you say a lot of complex words, you say something complex about, let's say, hormones. That's one that most people can relate to. And you sound like the smartest person in the room, and you say things that are unintelligible to most people. And maybe even to someone who was educated in science, they go, that sounds right, but wait a minute, there's a couple things that are assumed here, or some leaps that were made. And then you go, and all that nonsense and magic, and guess what? Buy my book, or buy my product, or buy the supplement. So I think all of that is, you can be fooled if it's just about knowledge. But if you were able to develop critical thinking, and you can understand logic, and you can understand when someone is displaying the behaviors that probably indicate they value the truth rather than they value, ego or the dollar or followers first. Not that there's anything wrong with making money or having followers or anything like that, but if your primary principle is getting closer to the truth, that should be displayed in one's behavior, and that's who you want to follow, regardless of whether you're don't have even a high school education and you're just an athlete, or whether you're a PhD academic.
Thanks very much for that, Eric. That's very well explained, and we're just about on time, and I want to thank you for going into such depth into your story. I don't think, out of all the podcasts that I've listened over the years, a lot of the questions, people often just picking on your knowledge that you've learned along the way rather than your story. So I really appreciate you giving this different angle and going into your journey along the way. And it's been very interesting for me to listen to your story. And you've had quite a big impact on me personally, as a bodybuilder, and also as someone who will eventually progress my academic career, and you've helped me out a lot with my masters and making decisions there. So I want to thank you for that. But where can we find more about Eric, and what are you going to be doing in the near future?
Well, first, I just want to say I really appreciate that. That's an honor you've given me, and I think you're going to take this as far as you want, Adam, and it'll be to all of our benefit for you to do that. So much appreciated for the platform and the kind words. As far as where you can find me, you can find me along with the rest of the 3D Muscle Journey team at 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, then the word musclejourney.com. And from there, you can find links to my books, the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which you mentioned, or our monthly applications and strength sport research review that I do along with Dr. Zerdos, Trexler, and Greg Knuckles. You can find the blog posts at 3DMJ that I contribute to regularly, our podcast that we're well into triple digits now, and you can hear the whole team talking natural bodybuilding, powerlifting, and kind of the whole coaching and competitive experience. You can also follow myself and Omar Isuf on Iron Culture, which is available on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. And then lastly, if you want more daily content, you can find me at Helms 3DMJ on Instagram. And as far as what I'm up to, I'm going to be continuing to publish research and trying to make all that open access that hopefully directly impacts the community of drug-free lifters. And I will also be continuing on with Iron Culture and the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. And then myself personally, I'll be competing, hopefully, if all goes well and I don't break, which is the goal, in weightlifting, powerlifting, and strongman, doing the trifecta in 2020. And finding out what that experience teaches me. And yeah, that's the plan.
No bodybuilding?
Not for a while, man. Competitive starvation is something that I only come around to every few years. This last time, 8 years separated from my last season.
Hopefully not as long.
Yes, sir.
Well, Eric, thanks so much for coming on, and I really appreciate it again.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
So guys, I hope you enjoyed some of that conversation with Eric Helms, if not all of it, and you took some value from our conversation. It definitely was a little bit different than what you're probably used to, especially if you do listen to some of the episodes that Dr. Eric Helms records. But I think that it's good to sometimes go a little bit off topic or off the beaten path of what is discussed on other podcasts. I think that he gives great information out on a lot of other podcasts, but I tried to take a bit of a different approach and try to understand perhaps the way that somebody thinks or the overarching principles of how somebody gets to where they have a lot of knowledge, rather than just, picking away from their knowledge, so that people can start to apply that to their own thinking. And personally, I found it very helpful. I think it was a bit of a selfish episode because I do want to pursue my career, I think, at this point, in some form of academia, or at least continue on in academics as I progress my career. So this was a bit of a personal episode that I really enjoyed. But that's the great thing about a podcast. You can talk to whoever you want about whatever you want. But with that being said, if you have enjoyed the podcast and you do like listening to it, please do give me some feedback. If you want to get any of the links that Eric talked about, any of the books, or reach out to him, or follow some of his work, I'll leave all of the links in the show notes as well. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me. My email is always in the show notes. You can get me on Instagram. You can send me a direct message, or you can leave some comments on YouTube or iTunes or whatever it is. But please do leave some feedback, leave a rating and review, because that does really help with me getting on guests like Eric in the future. But without further ado, though, I want to end on a note here and say thank you for listening for the 2019. It sounds like this is the last episode. I probably will have more episodes before the end of the year. But I want to thank you for listening to this episode, and I will catch you in another one.